The legacy of sexual exploitation during the antebellum South is not confined to the past. It has continued to shape the descendants of enslaved people and their perceptions of race, gender, and power. The societal power structures established during slavery, particularly the exploitation of black women, have had deep-reaching implications that persist into modern times, both within the African American community and in the larger American social landscape. The enduring trauma of sexual violence inflicted on enslaved women has been passed down through generations, manifesting in complex ways within African American families. Sexual violence during slavery not only disrupted the lives of individual women, but also fractured family structures and created legacies of mistrust, fear, and pain. Enslaved women were often forcibly separated from their children, sold off to different plantations, and left with little agency over their own familial bonds. The persistent threat of sexual violence and exploitation made it difficult for enslaved people to form stable family units, as the whims of their enslavers could tear apart relationships at any moment. This destabilization of black families and communities during slavery set a precedent for the marginalization and devaluation of black women that continued long after the abolition of slavery. The sexualization of black women, rooted in the antebellum period, has persisted in American culture, where black women have historically been viewed through a lens of hypersexuality and moral depravity. This harmful stereotype was used to justify the systemic abuse of black women during slavery and has continued to inform the way black women are perceived and treated in contemporary society. Even after the end of the Civil War and the official abolition of slavery, black women in the South continued to face sexual exploitation at the hands of white men. The power dynamics that had defined the antebellum period did not simply disappear with emancipation. They were transformed into new forms of racial and sexual control. In the decades following the Civil War, black women were frequently subjected to sexual violence by white men, particularly in the Jim Crow South, where legal and extra-legal means were used to maintain white supremacy. The legacy of slavery's power dynamics, particularly the sexual exploitation of black women, remained a tool of oppression that reinforced racial hierarchies and kept African Americans in positions of subjugation. Moreover, the racial mixing that occurred as a result of the widespread rape of enslaved women by white men created complicated social dynamics in the South. Children born from these unions often occupied ambiguous social positions, as they were neither fully accepted into white society nor able to fully integrate into black communities. These mixed-race individuals, though technically slaves, were sometimes treated differently from other enslaved people, complicating the rigid racial distinctions that defined Southern society. The power dynamic between white men and enslaved women also had significant implications for how gender roles were constructed and understood in the antebellum South. White women, for instance, were positioned in direct opposition to enslaved black women in the societal hierarchy. While white women were expected to embody ideals of purity, chastity, and domestic virtue, enslaved women were seen as sexually deviant and morally corrupt, a perception that justified their exploitation. This binary view of womanhood reinforced the patriarchal structures that governed Southern society, as it allowed white men to control both white women through expectations of moral virtue and black women through sexual exploitation and abuse. White women in the antebellum South occupied a precarious position in relation to the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. Many white women were aware of the sexual abuse taking place on plantations and in households, but were often powerless to stop it or complicit in maintaining the status quo. In some cases, white women may have viewed enslaved women as threats to their own domestic and social standing, as the children born of these exploitative relationships were a visible reminder of their husbands' infidelity. The anger and resentment that white women felt toward their husbands were often misdirected toward the enslaved women themselves, leading to further mistreatment and abuse of enslaved women by white mistresses. This complex interplay of power, race, and gender meant that white women, while oppressed in their own right by the patriarchal system, were also complicit in the racial and sexual exploitation of enslaved women. The rigid social hierarchies that defined the antebellum South allowed white women to maintain a position of relative privilege over black women, even as they were subjugated by the same system that allowed for the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. In addition to the immediate physical and emotional trauma suffered by enslaved women, the sexual exploitation that occurred during the antebellum period had lasting effects on African American family structures and gender relations. The systemic rape of enslaved women created a legacy of sexual trauma that has been passed down through generations, shaping the ways in which African American families navigate issues of trust, power, and gender dynamics. The legacy of sexual exploitation during slavery also contributed to the development of negative stereotypes about black women, who have historically been portrayed as hypersexual and morally corrupt in American society. These stereotypes have had a profound impact on the lives of black women in the United States, influencing the ways in which they are treated in various institutions, including the legal system, the workplace, and the media. The sexualization and dehumanization of black women that began during slavery have persisted into modern times, where black women are often subject to heightened scrutiny and discrimination based on harmful stereotypes that originated in the antebellum South. The legacy of sexual exploitation during slavery also had profound implications for African American men, who were often powerless to protect the women in their lives from abuse. The emasculation of black men during slavery, where they were unable to fulfill traditional masculine roles as protectors and providers, created deep-seated feelings of frustration, anger, and shame. These emotions were compounded by the knowledge that white men could exploit black women with impunity, further reinforcing the power dynamic that kept both black men and women in positions of subjugation. The power dynamics and sexual exploitation that defined the institution of slavery in the antebellum South had far-reaching consequences that continue to shape the experiences of African Americans today. The legacies of trauma, dehumanization, and racialized sexual violence established during this period have left an indelible mark on American society, influencing the ways in which race, gender, and power are understood and navigated in contemporary culture. Sexual exploitation in the antebellum South cannot be understood in isolation from the broader system of power dynamics that defines Southern society. The intersection of race, gender, and power created an environment in which the sexual exploitation of enslaved women was not only tolerated but institutionalized. This exploitation was a reflection of the larger social order that placed white men at the top of the hierarchy, with absolute control over the lives of both black men and women. In understanding the legacy of sexual exploitation during slavery, it is crucial to recognize the ways in which these power dynamics have continued to shape American society long after the abolition of slavery. The dehumanization of black women, the emasculation of black men, and the perpetuation of harmful racial stereotypes are all part of the legacy of sexual exploitation during the antebellum period, a legacy that continues to influence the ways in which race, gender, and power are understood in the United States today.